In this episode, we're going to talk about evidence and documentation as if they are part of the cardholder data environment, CDE, itself, because in practice they often behave that way. New learners sometimes treat evidence collection as a simple administrative chore, like gathering screenshots and saving files until the assessment is over. The problem with that mindset is that evidence frequently contains sensitive details, such as network diagrams, system names, user lists, configuration settings, and sometimes even fragments of the primary account number, PAN, that appear in logs or reports. If evidence is handled casually, you can create new exposure while trying to prove you have controls, and that is one of the most painful kinds of failure because it is completely avoidable. A qualified security assessor, QSA, is expected to handle evidence in a way that preserves confidentiality, preserves integrity, and preserves traceability, which means evidence must be protected from unauthorized access, protected from accidental modification, and organized so it can be retrieved and explained later. Handling evidence safely and systematically is not just about good housekeeping. It is about ensuring the assessment process does not become its own security incident. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A safe and systematic approach starts with recognizing what evidence really is in a PCI assessment. Evidence is anything that supports a conclusion about a requirement, which can include policies, procedures, diagrams, configuration exports, screenshots, logs, tickets, reports, and interviews. Some evidence is high sensitivity because it reveals how the environment is built and how it is defended. Other evidence is high sensitivity because it contains data that could be misused directly, such as user account lists, administrative permissions, or transaction information. Beginners sometimes assume that because evidence is used for compliance, it is automatically safe, but that is not true. Evidence is often a concentrated snapshot of the organization's security posture, which is exactly the kind of material an attacker would love to obtain. That means evidence handling should follow a simple principle. Collect only what you need, protect it while you have it, and retain it only as long as required by the assessment process and governance rules. When you apply that principle consistently, you reduce the risk that the documentation layer becomes a new weak link. Confidentiality is the first safety concern, and confidentiality means the right people can access evidence and the wrong people cannot. In practical terms, evidence should be stored in controlled repositories with access restricted to the assessment team and any authorized stakeholders. Evidence should not be scattered across personal desktops, email inboxes, and untracked file shares, because scattered storage increases the chance of accidental exposure. It also makes it harder to ensure that copies are cleaned up later. For beginners, it can help to think of evidence like a set of keys. If you hand out copies widely, you lose track of who can enter the environment. If you store keys in multiple drawers, you cannot confidently secure them. A QSA will handle evidence in a way that demonstrates professional discipline, because professional discipline is part of the trust relationship in an assessment. It is also part of the ethical responsibility of working with sensitive data about real systems that process payments. Integrity is the second safety concern, and integrity means evidence remains accurate and unaltered from the moment it was collected. This matters because the assessment conclusions depend on evidence being trustworthy. If evidence can be modified accidentally, or if different versions float around without clarity, the assessment record becomes fragile. Integrity is not only about preventing malicious tampering. It is also about preventing mistakes, like editing a configuration file to remove sensitive lines before saving it and then forgetting that you altered the record. A safer approach is to preserve original evidence and create separate redacted versions when redaction is necessary, clearly labeling each one. Beginners often misunderstand redaction and believe it always improves safety, but redaction can introduce risk if it destroys information needed to validate a control or if it creates confusion about what was original. A QSA approach is to control redaction carefully, making sure the original is preserved in a restricted space and the shared version contains only what is necessary for review. Integrity also depends on consistent naming, version control, and audit trails that show who uploaded or accessed evidence, which supports both security and defensibility. Traceability is the third safety concern, and traceability means you can connect each piece of evidence to the specific requirement and test its supports. This is where systematic handling becomes a quality driver. If evidence is organized well, you can quickly answer questions like which artifacts support a particular conclusion, when they were collected, and who provided them. If evidence is disorganized, you end up searching through piles of files during stressful moments, and that is when mistakes happen, such as using the wrong screenshot or losing track of which environment a report came from. AQSA works in a world where assessments are reviewed, questioned, and sometimes re-examined later. That means evidence has to be organized so that your reasoning can be reconstructed. For beginners, it is helpful to see traceability as the map between evidence and claims. If the map is missing, claims become harder to defend. If the map is clear, the assessment becomes calmer because the proof is easy to find and explain. A systematic evidence process also starts earlier than most people think, because evidence quality is influenced by how you ask for it. If you request evidence in vague terms, you will receive vague artifacts that do not prove what you need. If you request evidence in overly broad terms, you may receive sensitive data you did not need, increasing risk. The sweet spot is requesting evidence that is specific enough to be relevant and minimal enough to be safe. For example, if you need proof of an access review, you may need a record showing the review occurred, who performed it, what systems it covered, and what outcomes were recorded, but you may not need to collect full user lists with sensitive details. If you need proof of logging review, you may need a sample of review records and evidence that alerts were handled, but you may not need full raw logs containing sensitive transaction data. The more thoughtful your requests, the safer your evidence repository becomes. This is also part of respecting the assessed organization, because over-collecting evidence can feel like unnecessary exposure. AQSA who handles evidence responsibly builds trust, and that trust helps the assessment run smoothly. Evidence safety also includes secure transfer, because evidence often moves from the assessed organization to the assessor. Transfer is a moment of risk. If evidence is sent through uncontrolled channels, such as personal email or consumer file sharing, it can be intercepted or misdelivered. Even simple mistakes like sending a file to the wrong recipient can create a breach. A systematic process defines approved transfer methods and uses them consistently. It also includes verifying receipt and confirming that only the intended parties have access. For beginners, the key is to realize that secure storage is not enough if you move evidence insecurely. The chain of custody for evidence starts at collection and continues through transfer and storage. AQSA will treat that chain seriously because it protects both parties. It protects the assessed organization from exposure, and it protects the assessor from questions about whether evidence was handled appropriately. When evidence transfer is disciplined, it also reduces confusion about which files are final and which files are drafts. Retention is another part of safe evidence handling, because evidence should not live forever without a reason. Keeping evidence longer than necessary increases risk, especially when evidence contains sensitive details. Retention decisions should align with legal requirements, contractual obligations, and professional standards, but the guiding principle remains that you should retain what you must and purge what you do not need. This is not only a security best practice, it is also a scope management practice, because evidence repositories can become shadow data stores that contain more sensitive information than many production systems. Beginners sometimes overlook this because evidence feels separate from operations, but evidence often includes information that could help an attacker, and that means it deserves retention governance. AQSA should know the retention rules that apply to their work and should communicate those rules clearly so both parties understand what will happen to evidence after the assessment. Confidence grows when evidence handling is predictable rather than improvised. Documentation quality also depends on consistency, because assessments span many requirements and often involve many stakeholders. Inconsistent documentation creates confusion and can make evidence appear weaker than it is. Consistency includes using stable naming conventions, consistent file structures, and consistent metadata, such as dates and scope references. It also includes documenting context for evidence, such as which system it relates to and what control it supports. Without context, a screenshot is just an image, and later you may not remember what it proved. Context turns evidence into proof. For beginners, it helps to imagine you will have to explain your assessment to someone who never attended the meetings and never visited the environment. If you can hand them your evidence repository and they can follow it, then your documentation is systematic. If they would be lost, then you have hidden risk. A QSA who documents systematically reduces their own stress because the work becomes easier to navigate, and it improves the quality of the final report because conclusions can be supported cleanly. Safety in documentation also includes minimizing the inclusion of sensitive data inside the report itself. Reports are meant to be shared with stakeholders, and stakeholders may not all have the same need to know. If you include overly detailed configurations, raw logs, or full user lists in the report, you increase exposure. A better approach is to include enough detail to support conclusions without embedding high-risk secrets. When detailed evidence is required, it can be kept in a controlled evidence repository rather than placed in the report body. This is where AQSA must balance clarity with discretion. Clarity does not require revealing every technical detail. It requires explaining what was validated and why it supports the conclusion. A beginner might think that more detail equals stronger evidence, but more detail can also equal more risk. Strong evidence is relevant and sufficient, not maximal. This principle also helps the assessed organization because it reduces the chance that sensitive operational details are shared beyond the core assessment audience. Handling evidence safely also means being mindful of accidental sensitive data capture, especially when collecting logs, database extracts, or transaction reports. Even in well-run environments, sensitive data can appear where it should not, such as in error logs or debugging output. When that happens, the evidence itself can become regulated data that must be protected. A systematic approach includes screening evidence for unintended sensitive fields and taking appropriate steps if they are discovered. Appropriate steps might include limiting distribution, using redaction for shared versions, and informing the organization so the underlying issue can be remediated. For beginners, this is an important mindset shift. Evidence is not only a mirror of controls, it can also reveal control failures. If sensitive data appears in logs, that is not just an evidence handling problem. It is a security problem that may need corrective action. AQSA should be prepared to handle that discovery responsibly and without causing unnecessary exposure by passing the file around casually. Another quality layer is making sure interview notes and verbal confirmations are handled carefully, because conversations often include details that are sensitive even if no files are exchanged. Interview notes can include names, roles, access patterns, and system descriptions that could be misused. They also become part of the assessment record, so they should be stored securely and tied to the conclusions they support. Verbal statements should not be treated as primary evidence for controls that require operational proof, but they do provide context and can guide where to look for stronger artifacts. A systematic approach captures interview context in a controlled way, avoids unnecessary personal data, and links the notes to the requirement being validated. For beginners, it is important to see interviews as part of evidence collection, not as separate from it. If you handle files carefully but keep notes casually, you have still created a weak link. The safest programs treat all assessment artifacts as sensitive. As we close, remember that handling evidence and documentation safely and systematically is both a security responsibility and a quality responsibility. You protect confidentiality by controlling access and limiting unnecessary collection. You protect integrity by preserving originals, managing versions, and separating redacted copies from source artifacts. You ensure traceability by organizing evidence, so each artifact clearly supports a specific requirement and conclusion. You reduce risk by using secure transfer methods and by applying retention rules that prevent evidence from becoming a long-lived shadow data store. You improve assessment quality by requesting evidence thoughtfully, documenting context consistently, and keeping reports clear without embedding unnecessary sensitive details. For AQSA, these practices make the assessment more defensible and less stressful because you can always show what you tested and why, without worrying that your own process created new exposure. When evidence handling is treated as a disciplined control, it becomes a quiet source of confidence that supports every other part of the PCI assessment.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.